Hey everyone, it's Amar from Toronto.
And it's Aaron from the City of Good Neighbors. Just kidding. It's the city where police shove old men and crack their skulls on the pavement.
And then just continue walking past.
Yep, I would say this is the world we live in now, but that's not true. This is the world we've been living in.
Also, it's funny that you say that under the assumption that people will know what city you're talking about, but we live in such a hell world that that could literally apply to 50 cities right now in America.
Yeah, it's a really disturbing video that came out, but more disturbing is the violence that is being inflicted specifically upon Black and Indigenous people.
Yeah, so I do want to say that we here at Death Criminals stand in solidarity with the uprising in America and the solidarity protests in the world. And we really wish our comrades down south the best of luck and to be safe.
We are here with you both on an emotional level and on a physical level.
Yeah.
Today's episode, we're offering a little bit, hopefully, of respite from that.
Yeah, it's a nice, if you want to listen to an episode about history, I picked the topic. So if you hate it, email me, criticize me, tell all your enemies about this episode. But if you like it, tell me that you like it. Text us on Instagram.
Actually, all criticisms must be sent by U.S. Postal Service, and Amr lives in Canada, so good luck, everyone.
And please do include your return address so I could write you back my response to your criticism.
Yeah.
Well, today's episode is about a certain Ronald. And no, it's not Ronald McDonald. It's the second worst Ronald Wilson Reagan. And the hostage crisis that we spoke about on an earlier episode 7, yes.
You don't need to listen to our previous Iran episodes to get this one. All of our episodes, unless otherwise noted, are separate from each other. But if you're really interested in Iran and the politics of Iran and how the United States has consistently meddled in them, check those out.
Yeah, they're not prerequisites, but if you want to go in depth on the history, episode 7 is a good place to start for today. But again, everything here is standalone, like Aaron said, so you don't have to listen to it. On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States. At the same time, halfway across the world, 52 American hostages that have been held by the Islamic Republic of Iran were released to U.S. personnel after 444 days in captivity since 1979. Although those events appear unrelated at first glance, the links between them run deep, like roots underneath a forest floor. As we have previously discussed on episode 7 of this podcast, there have been persistent rumors surrounding the release of those hostages. In particular, it has been alleged during the 1980 presidential elections, the Reagan campaign reached out to Iran and intentionally sabotaged their negotiations with then-sitting President Jimmy Carter. Reagan offered Iran much better terms to keep the hostages and so deliberately decimated the popularity of the incumbent Carter. In return, Reagan promised that should he win, Iran would receive weapons, funds, and etc. from the US government. Fast forward to January 20th, 1981, and as Ronald Reagan places his hands on a Bible to swear the oath of the presidency, 52 Americans were shuttled from Tehran via Algeria, Germany, and Ireland, and finally to the United States. Little did people know at the time that there was the tip of an iceberg that spans 3 continents, paramilitary death squads, metric tons of cocaine, and various American political figures committing high treason and getting away with it. So to begin, if you have a globe at home, there's going to be a lot of spinning of the globe. We're continent hopping. So to begin, I'd like to begin with the Iran-Iraq War, which began on September 22nd, 1980, with Saddam Hussein's Iraq invading his neighbor Iran, especially the oil-rich southwestern province of Khuzestan. Saddam at this point has calculated that Iran would have been unstable following the 1979 Islamic Revolution and thus vulnerable to attack.
Yeah, this is a pretty consistent pattern with Saddam Hussein. He thinks that every invasion is going to be really easy and fast and go super well, and it never does. He did that in Kuwait once again. This is a pattern with the United States too, so like we're not going to sit here and point fingers.
Yeah, but to be fair, with his assessment of Kuwait, it was accurate. Like, he did conquer Kuwait in like a couple of months. It was just the fact that Kuwait's allies, Saudi especially, and the US didn't, well, depending on what theory you believe, they weren't okay with him taking Kuwait.
Yeah, he made this very small mistake where he forgot the rest of the world exists.
Yeah. Yeah, he thought the entire world was Iraq and Kuwait, and that was about it.
Yeah.
Also, the idiot started launching from Kuwait, he started launching rockets into Saudi, which is when everyone got really nervous because they thought he was going to take eastern provinces of Saudi, which were also very oil rich.
Yeah.
But in this case, his aims were to take the Shatt al-Arab waterway, which was the waterway connecting the Tigris and Euphrates to the Persian Gulf. Of course, the name Persian Gulf is controversial, whether you want to call it Persian Gulf, Arab Gulf, etc., etc. We'll call it the Gulf for now.
The Gulf.
Yeah, the Gulf, whose name shall not be spoken. The you-know-who Gulf. An annex...
I'm sorry. Calling it the you-know-who Gulf only makes it stronger.
As Dumbledore once said, fear of a name increases fear of a thing itself, which means we are terrified of this Gulf. We really are. The Gulf that shall not be named.
The Gulf, and specifically control over the Gulf, is a consistent source of problems.
Well, yeah, and it stemmed down to the very name of it. I remember when I was in Bahrain in school, we had geography and social studies classes, and all the maps labeled it the Arab Gulf. No single map labels the Persian Gulf, even though anywhere else you'd go, it'd be called the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, I think our maps say the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, the insert name here Gulf. How about that? Well, the Shatt al-Arab was connecting the Tigris and Euphrates to the Gulf, and Saddam also wanted to annex Khuzestan, which is this oil-rich southwestern province in Iran. Saddam also hoped that the ethnic Arab minority would rise up to support Iraq. This ethnic Arab minority definitely being concentrated in Khuzestan, but Arabs in Iran actually fought alongside the Islamic Republic's army in defending their cities block by block, especially the Battle of Khorramshahr, in which Saddam thought he would just steamroll and open the way to Tehran, but ended up bogged down for a couple of months, buying Iran enough time to plan a counterattack. Iran, of course, under the Shah before this, was armed and supplied by the United States, so all their weapons, all their planes, everything was American-made. So the Islamic Republic of Iran, post-revolution, needed American weapons, and the US was not selling them any, openly at least, after 1979.
It's probably worth noting here, too, that after the revolution of 1979, all of those weapons were still in Iran, were available to the new Islamic Republic, but you also need parts and things like that, and those were harder to get.
Yeah, like to maintain your planes and so on. If a plane breaks down and you need spare parts, and America isn't selling you, then you have a problem. Your plane isn't flying. It's quite
right.
Tricky. It's also why arms deals are so lucrative, not in and of themselves as they are lucrative, but also if you tie down a country to your own arms manufacturers and suppliers, then they have to come back to you to keep their planes fixed and fueled, their spare parts, etc., etc.
Exactly.
So if you're looking at your globe, spin it a little bit, not too much, because we are shifting the eye of Sauron, if you will, to the Lebanese Civil War. So at this time in history, the civil war in Lebanon was raging on with no end in sight.
We are not going to get too much into Lebanon's civil war here. Don't worry, we definitely will in future episodes. I actually wrote my master's thesis on the Lebanese civil war, so I don't know what to call you, fans of that. Don't worry. But we should probably note here that some people will sometimes refer to the war in Lebanon as une guerre des autres. I probably butchered that.
I think that's the right one, yeah.
Yeah, it means a war of others. And by this, they usually mean that Lebanon served as a proxy theater for American, Soviet, Israeli, Iranian, Syrian, and Palestinian conflicts. I personally am very, very critical of this phrase, but they're emphasizing the participation of these groups over the participation of Lebanese citizens.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of this theory either because it completely hijacks agency from Lebanese people as a people and makes them nothing but pawns, which is kind of insulting, really.
Well, that's kind of the point, is to say it's not we didn't do this. It was other people in our country, but not us.
Yeah, that makes sense in the way that it absolves responsibility, but I'm not a big fan of that. Like, I'm on the same perspective as you, at least.
Mm-hmm.
So, starting in 1982, foreign, and by foreign I mean Western and European, individuals in Beirut were very susceptible to kidnapping by various organizations, but in this case, an organization calling itself Islamic Jihad.
So, the group that is now known as Hezbollah wasn't officially formed until 1985, and even the Islamic Jihad in Lebanon wasn't calling itself such until 1983. But the hostage taking was almost certainly engineered by groups in Lebanon with ties to Iran. Regarding the guerre de sot, regarding the position we just discussed, there are some people who put responsibility for the hostage taking pretty much entirely on Iran. I think it's way more complicated than that, but it's something worth pointing out. If you ask 10 different Lebanese people about the role of Iran in Lebanon, you're going to get 10 different answers.
Honestly, I love discussing politics with fellow Arabs because you can put like 5 Arabs in a room about any given political issue and you'll get 12 different answers about the same issue. Just incredible discussions.
Yeah.
So, to go on that, in this case, the kidnappings were done by various groups. Islamic Jihad didn't exist as such until 1983, like Aaron said. But the kidnappings we're going to focus on here were done by groups that had ties to Iran, whether it was Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah. And the specific hostages we're focusing on are 25 Americans, even though you had all sorts of foreigners being kidnapped. 16 Frenchmen, 12 British, 7 Swiss, 7 West Germans, and 1 Irishman. And they were all kidnapped between 1982 and 1992. And some died and some survived and were freed. So results of those kidnappings varied. But in this particular case, we're focusing on the 25 Americans.
Also, on the 4th of July in 1982, 3 Iranian diplomats and 1 reporter from the Islamic Republic news agency were abducted, and they have still never been found. The strongest suspects in that are the right-wing Lebanese forces, likely with aid from Israel, but it really just goes to show hostage-taking and forced disappearances went both ways.
Yeah, and these kidnappings is what prompted the US, the Reagan administration, to start selling arms secretly to Iran, who were in this war and they needed weapons, parts, so on and so forth, via Israel because, it was secret. And in return, Iran would pressure its groups in Lebanon to release those hostages. So the way it would work is that Israel would sell Iran its stock of US arms because Israel was being supplied by the US, especially TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, as well as spare parts and ammunition. And the US will then replenish Israel's stock with the understanding that those weapons were going to Iran. You might be asking now, wait a second. How is Israel arming Iran? Don't they hate Iran? I mean, even Netanyahu went in front of Congress with a cartoonish drawing of a bomb to talk about Iran. But at this time, Israel saw Saddam's Iraq as a bigger threat to its territorial integrity and project than Iran. And to an extent, they were right. Saddam's Iraq had the bigger army. They were much better equipped, much better trained, whereas Iran had just come out of a revolution and they were exhausted. The US and Israel also wanted to prolong the Iran-Iraq war to exhaust 2 enemies. In this case, the common saying goes, you hit 2 birds with 1 TOW missile.
Oh, that's quaint. Yeah, the US does this pretty frequently. Actually, for instance, they waited to declare war on the Nazis to try and let the USSR do most of the fighting and weaken both of those countries. But the attack on Pearl Harbor ended up really pushing them to jump in.
Yeah, it's the same in the Eastern Pacific theater where the Soviets were ready to invade Japan, but the US decided to test out their nuclear bombs just to flex their muscles, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where things get quite messy but interesting. Reagan started selling arms to Iran via Israel since 1981, a full year before the first American hostages were taken in Lebanon.
Oops.
To clarify, Iran was placed on the state sponsors of terrorism list in 1984, during their war with Iraq. And publicly, Reagan was, denouncing Iran, terrorists, etc., and supporting Iraq in the war. But since 1981, he was selling Iran weapons via Israel. And even though it went through Israel, it also included middlemen, including a man by the name of Adnan Khashoggi. If you're familiar with the last name, it's because his nephew, Jamal, he experienced the movie Saw in real life in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul a few years back. It was I think last year or 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah, 2 years ago, 2018, yeah. Everyone knows Khashoggi, but Adnan, his uncle, was arms dealer and a notable socialite and a billionaire. And funnily enough, Adnan Khashoggi sold his super yacht to Donald Trump. So connections all around.
Yeah, also, I don't think a lot of people realize how easy it is to launder money, weapons, oil, and even antiquities through the Middle East. ISIS actually managed to smuggle out and sell petroleum to refineries in the region, which was then just sold as regular oil. It's not like the Gulf Cooperation Council doesn't have its own list of human rights abuses as long as you're armed, but it's pretty significant that ISIS could sell oil that ended up at your regular gas station.
Oh, absolutely. It's really funny because when you look at cities like Dubai or even countries like Bahrain, it's interesting because officially they'll say that they have part of their economy is the quote unquote finance sector, financial services. But if you actually dig in, most of that is money laundering. It's just code. It's funny terms for money laundering. That's what they do.
Oh, yeah. Bahrain is just a money laundering operation.
Pretty
no
much.
Offense.
Yeah, no. I absolutely agree. If you go to the Bahrain Bay, the financial harbor, all of that, you see all these skyscrapers with all these offices, but it's just one giant money laundering operation.
Mm-hmm.
So Reagan's government was internally talking about arming quote-unquote moderate Iranian factions led by then Speaker of Parliament Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. And Reagan's team hoped that Rafsanjani would then exert pressure on Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah or these groups to release those hostages, and also believed that Rafsanjani's faction would reestablish relationships with the US after Ayatollah Khomeini's death. Keep in mind that at that time, Rafsanjani was seen as the de jure successor for Khomeini in terms of being the supreme Ayatollah of the country. So the Reagan administration saw him as a potential future, not necessarily an ally, but an associate, and they wanted to pull Iran back into the US orbit for fear of it falling with the Soviets. They were shoveling arms into Rafsanjani's hands. So if you're looking at your globe, now you need to spend a bit stronger because we're going all the way to South America at the same time to the country of Nicaragua, which also in 1979 was experiencing major upheavals and historic change. In 1979 in Nicaragua, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FSLN, or as we're going to call them from now on, the Sandinistas, were a socialist group that overthrew the US-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza Debayle after a decade of guerrilla war. They established a revolutionary junta, and they were backed by Cuba, Panama, and other socialist nations. The dictator, Somoza, was exiled to neighboring Honduras. In 1981, when Reagan comes to power, his foreign policy is to reheat the Cold War, and really, really virulent anti-communist rhetoric and action emanates from the White House. With Nicaragua especially, Reagan basically de facto applied a continuation of the Monroe Doctrine, where Nicaragua was seen as being in U.S.'s backyard. Communism was not allowed in South America. So Reagan begins backing, funding, and arming the Contra-Revolucion group, i.e. the Contras, which is this group of former security officials, former military personnel of the Somoza government that have been hanging out on the border with Honduras. They had a vested interest in the Somoza government, so they weren't exactly big fans of the Sandinistas. In 1982, Congress votes to restrict U.S. funds to the Contras because the Contras were not as universally popular in the U.S. as revisionist history would lead us to believe. Looking at you, Ana Navarro. But at the time, Congress, they didn't want to get involved in the Nicaraguan civil war. And so During the annual budgetary, like they pass a bill to fund the government, basically. The Boland Amendment, named after Democratic Senator from Massachusetts, Edward Boland, restricted U.S. funds to the Contra, starting in the fiscal year of 1983. So, starting in the fiscal year of 1983, any money that the Congress authorizes for the U.S. executive branch, the presidency, is not allowed to go to the Contras for their military aid and training. So I want to read one of the amendments were renewed year after year, of course, as they pass bills to fund the government year after year. So I want to read the amendment that was written in 1984 for the appropriations bill. Quote, during the fiscal year of 1985, no funds available to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities may be obligated or expended for the purpose of or which may have the effect of supporting directly or indirectly military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua by any nation, organization, group, movement, or individual. End quote. This is all basically legal speak to say the money we're authorizing the executive branch to use cannot in any way, shape, or form be sent to Nicaragua for any military or paramilitary operations by any group there, whether it's the Sandinistas or the Contras. This started a conflict between the Reagan administration and Congress because Reagan claims that the National Security Council, which was funding the Contras at the time, was technically not an intelligence agency.
Ah, yes, the good old, well, technically.
Yeah, our friend Ronald is quite the pedant, the semantic expert.
Mm-hmm.
So Congress began expanding the wording of the ban every year to try and counter Reagan's technicalities. But then it revealed a fundamental contradiction in the US government, where Reagan asserts that foreign policy in general is the purview of the executive branch, so he should be allowed to do whatever he wants in terms of foreign policy, whereas Congress claims that this is not about foreign policy, it's a budgetary matter because Congress authorizes the money, so it's a responsibility of Congress to decide what that money is being used for. Basically, he said, she said, and Reagan was being like a kid in a playground going, and Congress was like, oh yes, and so on and so forth.
I could see no way this could possibly go wrong.
Narrator, it went very wrong. Our intrepid hero, our unsung hero, our knight in shining armor in this story is a man by the name of Oliver North, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North to be exact. On the 4th of December 1985, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, who was serving Reagan at the time, resigns openly to spend time with his family, basically retiring.
Okay, these people hate their families, though.
Oh, they're...
I'm just saying.
I agree with Aaron. Whenever you hear the news that someone resigned to spend time with their family, you have to dig in because they're absolutely not spending time with their family. Something is going on.
Yeah, it's like how John McCain stayed on pretty much until his death, because why would he want to spend time with Meghan McCain?
It's not just Meghan McCain. Like, John McCain has been reported multiple times basically shouting and abusing his wife and so on. Like, these people
Really?
are ghouls, yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, like, it's funny, the people who most openly talk about family values just despise their own families.
Yeah, that's true, actually. It's a very performative thing.
Yeah, it's like family values in the abstract, but actual family, like, they can't stand each other.
Love your family unless they're gay or something, and
Yeah.
then kick them out and torture them.
Yeah, or even just if you're out with your wife and she does something that annoys you, just shout at her in front of reporters.
Humiliate her.
Yeah. Apparently, Robert McFarlane, being the family man that he is, decided to retire to spend time with said family that he probably despises. And it's important to know that at this time, McFarlane has been the loudest voice in leading the side that advocated for rapprochement with Iran in Reagan's administration. And he was, suggesting to Reagan to sell arms to try and make relations more pleasant between the two countries. So the same day that McFarlane resigns, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North proposes a change in the plans that they were conducting at the time in terms of transferring arms to Iran. So the first thing is that instead of supplying arms via Israel, they will henceforth directly sell Iran the weapons, but at a much higher markup because it's direct.
Cut out the middleman.
Yeah, and keep all the money for yourself. Smart business. The art of the deal, if you will.
Ew.
It was a twin approach, a twin-pronged approach. And the other aspect of this is the profits they make by selling those weapons to Iran will be redirected to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, bypassing Congress and their appropriations bills and their money. So because the money is coming from selling weapons, then it's not Congress's money technically, so they could do whatever the hell they want with it.
Yeah, I feel like we should probably note here that it's also not the Reagan administration's money. That's not how that works.
Yeah, it's not, but if you sit Reagan down, assuming that his brain hasn't turned to mush by then, he would tell you it is their money.
Right.
Yeah. It was a clear violation of law, but they were being semantic by going around Congress in that manner and using the money to arm the Contras.
Yeah, it's all underground.
Yeah. Negotiations between Iran and the US were done via the National Security Council, and specifically by Admiral John Poindexter and his deputy, Oliver North. And they were also the middlemen for negotiating with the Contras and arranging for delivery of weapons and arms to the Contras.
So we're actually talking about more than one scandal and cover-up here, because you have the OG scandal, which is the Reagan administration selling arms to Iran through backdoor channels. And then you have the later redirection of those funds to the Contras in Nicaragua. So this is a pretty significant operation.
Yeah, I agree. It had to have involved a lot of levers and a lot of people keeping track of things. And to be clear, Reagan selling arms to Iran until 1984 was legal, even though it was frowned upon because it was highly hypocritical. But after 1984, with Iran being placed on the state-sponsored of terrorism list, it was illegal. Likewise, after the Boland Amendments, Reagan funding the Contras was also illegal because he was going around Congress and misappropriating money to fund an organization that was basically a death squad.
Precisely.
All of this is happening in secret, underground. No one knows, well, besides the people who are doing it, few knew about it, until October 5 of 1986, when a man by the name of Eugene Hassenfuss, a former Marine, is captured after his plane is shot down over Nicaragua.
Wah, wah.
The Sandinistas discover a large supplies of arms on the plane, and Hassenfuss alleges in a press conference held in Nicaragua that two of his Nicaraguan associates were actually CIA agents. Of course, a few days later, he retracts this, saying he doesn't know whether they are CIA agents or not. There's confusion whether he was, forced to admit this or not. But knowing the CIA and from our previous episodes of what they did to Iran, I wouldn't be surprised, let's just say that, if they were CIA agents. A month later, Mehdi Hashemi, a senior official in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, leaks information to a Lebanese magazine by the name of Sharah, who then published an expose on the selling of arms to Iran by the United States in their magazine on November 3rd, 1986. So the two sides of this deal, this scandal, this entire operation are being revealed almost within a month of each other. Yeah, I have to admit, the timing is very precise on this. Very nice, very pleasant to have.
Well, I think it's like once the operation starts to crumble, it is politically wise for some people to try to get ahead of that and start dishing to kind of distance themselves from the actual underhanded things they were doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's totally understand. Yeah.
They turned themselves into whistleblowers despite the fact that they were in on it until it started going south.
Yeah, it's to cover their own asses. Like, it's smart.
Right.
It's cunning, but yeah.
How does Reagan respond to this?
Oh, boy, this is going to be fun. Reagan's response comes 10 days after this expose on November 13th, 1986, and he responds with an address from the White House in which I'm going to quote the last two paragraphs. It's a long address. We're going to link it in the sources, but I'm going to quote the last two paragraphs. Quote, "To summarize, our government has a firm policy not to capitulate to terrorist demands, that no concessions policy remains in force, in spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments. We did not, Repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we. Those who think we have gone soft on terrorism should take up the question with Colonel Gaddafi. We have not, nor will we capitulate to terrorists. We will, however, get on with advancing the vital interests of our great nation, in spite of terrorists and radicals who seek to sabotage our efforts and immobilize the United States. Our goals have been and remain to restore a relationship with Iran, to bring an honorable end to the war in the Gulf, and to bring a halt to state-sponsored terror in the Middle East, and finally, to effect the safe return of all hostages from Lebanon. As president, I've always operated on the belief that given the facts, the American people will make the right decision. I believe that to be true now. I cannot guarantee you the outcome, but as in the past, I ask for your support because I believe you share the hope for peace in the Middle East, for freedom for all hostages, and for a world free of terrorism. Certainly, there are risks in this pursuit, but there are greater risks if we do not persevere. It will take patience and understanding. It will take continued resistance to those who commit terrorist acts, and it will take cooperation with all who seek to rid the world of this scourge. Thank you, and God bless you.
I believe that the political term for such a statement is malarkey. Did I get that right?
Yeah, it is. It is a scientific term. A lot of scientists use that term in their research papers. It is 100% malarkey. It is statistically significant malarkey. We're going to get into his speech after things unravel because it is hilarious. I mean, it's really depressing, but also hilarious.
Also, when he says, just ask Gaddafi, oh, you mean the other person that the US has been accused many times of collaborating with secretly?
yeah, actually, I didn't realize that until you just mentioned that, but it's so funny because on the one hand, they're selling arms and weapons to Gaddafi. On the other hand, they're they carpet bombed him a couple of times. And they're like, yeah, ask him. And if you ask him, his first thing will be like, who, the guys who are selling me weapons? Yeah, they're great, fantastic people.
Yeah, part of his record of public statements over and over again is saying, I'm not a threat to the United States in Europe. I'm a friend.
Yeah, and the US saw him as such for a long time.
Yeah.
As Reagan is giving this address from the great orator himself, Oliver North immediately begins disposing of all incriminating evidence. So him and his secretary, Fawn Hall, basically ended up testifying that they shredded enough documents between November 21st and 25th of 1986 that the shredder, this industrial-sized shredder, jammed multiple times.
Didn't the workers in the American embassy in Tehran try and fail to shred documents when the Iranian students captured the embassy in 1979, too?
Oh, yeah, they did. Well, they failed, and the failure is what ended up revealing all of the US's plans with Operation Ajax, which we discussed earlier.
Right. So I feel like if there's any lesson to be learned from our extended series on Iran, if you have sensitive documents, get an industrial shredder. My parents work in law, actually, and they have to pay a company to come and pick up documents and shred them.
Yeah, and I work in healthcare, and it's the same. If you want to get rid of documents, you put them in this locked, sealed bin, where once you put them in, you can't take them out because the bin is sealed. And once in a while, the hospital workers will come in, collect the bins, and send them to be shredded by this company that they hire.
Yeah, shredding is apparently a professional industry. And if you want to properly shred things, you can't just put them in your regular office shredder.
Yeah, especially if you for an operation this size, there must have been a lot of documents to shred in such a short period of time.
Right. So if you are listening to this and you are secretly selling weapons to Iran, think about investing in an industrial shredder right now.
Or if you're funding paramilitary death squads in South America.
Right. And if you happen to run an industrial shredder company, think about sponsoring us.
A lot of business opportunities for a lot of governments, just letting you guys know.
Yeah.
So one of the funny things is that these people are like piranhas. As soon as they're put in front of a committee, they just start turning on one another. It's just like fish eating each other. Oliver North testifies that he saw John Poindexter destroy what was the only copy of a signed presidential covert action document authorizing the CIA to sell Hawk missiles to Iran in 1985. Whether that document exists or not, I mean, it's all alleged, but North says that he saw Poindexter destroy it and it had Reagan's signature on it. So how much Reagan knew depends largely on how many documents were destroyed, really. On November 25th, 1986, U.S. Attorney General Edwin Meese admits publicly that the U.S. sold weapons to Iran and diverted the profits to the Contras. And on the same day, Reagan ends up firing Oliver North, while John Poindexter resigns from the National Security Council. Reagan also creates a special review board to investigate the entire affair, led by a former senator, John Tower. The commission ends up being called the Tower Commission. The Tower Commission basically drags Reagan's discombobulated, disheveled, shriveling brain to testify in front of them on December 2nd, 1986. He contradicts himself several times. He's all over the place, and he keeps saying that he forgot certain things. And it's hard to know whether this is dementia kicking in or whether it's genuinely him afraid of being incriminated for basically high treason.
Okay, what kind of country do we live in, or at least I live in, because you luckily live in Canada, that, oh, the president wasn't lying, he just has dementia, is a good excuse?
I mean, it's funny that this entire excuse can be applied to multiple US presidents and all the horrible shit they do.
Yeah, if you don't know this, Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's, and there are questions about, especially toward the end of his second term, how many decisions Ronald Reagan was actually making and how much he was literally just being puppeted by the people around him.
Yeah, and funnily enough, as a tangent, I think it was 1987 or 86 when the people around Reagan, the summary of it, I think it's a long story, but the summary of it is for a couple of days, they genuinely were planning a coup because they thought Reagan was so demented. They were deciding whether it would be viable to replace him with his vice president, H.W. Bush, and how to go about doing that, using like various amendments and so on. They didn't at the end of the day, but it came close, basically them getting Reagan out under the fact that he's mentally incompetent and replacing him with Bush.
Well, I do see, however, where it would be politically wise not to do that because Reagan was very popular at that time, and you could keep the popular guy and have him parrot the things that you'd like him to, and meanwhile be pulling all the strings behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's even easier because if he was suffering from advanced dementia at that age, then you just put any paper in front of him and he'll sign it regardless of what it is. So it's convenient for them.
With all of that, how did the Tower Commission go?
So the Tower Commission's report, published on the February 26, 1987, found that while Reagan was responsible through sheer carelessness and ignorance and otherwise not following up on his subordinates and not being careful enough to inspect his subordinates, he was not aware of the extent of the program and thus not deliberately guilty of treason.
What does that mean, not deliberately guilty? He's not deliberately innocent.
Yeah, basically they were saying that he was responsible much in the same way a CEO is responsible of his employees being like racist in the office or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying he's not if you're a leader, you are responsible for the people underneath you. That's kind of how leadership works. But the Tower Commission basically said that, yeah, he was an idiot and he didn't know what other people around him were doing, but he wasn't actually deliberately planning these operations himself.
Right. I'm sure the people whose family members were killed by the death squads took great comfort in that.
Yeah, I mean, fucking hell. I can't believe they got away with it. But anyways, to go back on our earlier conversation about Reagan's speech. So I quoted Reagan's earlier speech on November 13th when things were revealed. Now, after the Tower Commission's report, Reagan addresses the U.S. again from the White House on March 4th, 1987. And I'm just going to quote one paragraph from this address, and it shows everything, right? Quote, "A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not. As the Tower Board reported, what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated, and its implementation into trading arms for hostages. This runs counter to my own beliefs, to administration policy, and to the original strategy we had in mind." End quote. And to that, I want to respond by quoting a great Maoist third worldist philosopher by the name of Ben Shapiro in saying, "Facts don't care about your feelings, Ronald."
He had the best intentions, Amr.
Yeah, he had good vibes. He had good energy, you see.
Man.
And it's funny because he says, "My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true." A word I want to emphasize here is still. It's been 7 months. The Tower Commission comes out. Everyone knows that the arms were being sold for hostages, that the money was being funded to the Contras. And he's here sitting like the disheveled skeleton, this ghoul that he is, and saying that it still tells me that it's not true.
Also, in any other crime, basically, any other wrongdoing, nobody cares. A few minutes ago, when you pulled me over, I told you that I had not been drinking tonight. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the .24 I just blew into the breathalyzer tells me it's not.
Oh my god. Honestly, like, if I was a lawyer, then I'm definitely using that defense in court. A few minutes ago, I told you my client did not stab that woman to death. My heart and best intentions still tell me that's true, even though the photos, the video, and the evidence tells you it's not. I mean, It's high treason. Literally, what he committed was high treason. There's no ifs or buts about it. Even if he was not intentionally doing all of that, like if he was just careless about the people around him, like if the people underneath the CEO are doing money laundering and like doing illegal shit, the entire company is tried. No, like I can't just say, "Oh yeah, I didn't know my employees were like running people over." I'm still culpable for that.
I would say, too, as much as we hate Jeff Bezos, he's not funding death squads in Nicaragua. But now that I think about it, I don't know if that's true.
That we know of. That's a key word here.
Well, there's an argument that Amazon sells lots of things, like probably sells cocoa products, for instance, that are grown with slave labor. I wouldn't doubt it at all.
Oh, neither would I. I mean, the supply chains, the modern supply chains probably have various links that are pure slavery, if not like, close to slavery. You don't get to be the world's first trillionaire or soon to be world's first trillionaire without doing some very morally abhorrent things to get there.
If there's clearly high treason here, and Ronald Reagan and his supporters are all about patriotism, one would assume that this didn't go well for him, right?
You'd think so, and you wouldn't be ashamed for thinking so, but apparently Americans have the brains of goldfish. Actually, no, that's an insult to goldfish. It's just incredible how easily he coasted through it. So I want to quote Oliver North, who wrote in his memoirs years after the fact, quote, "Ronald Reagan knew of and approved a great deal of what went on with both the Iranian initiative and private efforts on behalf of the Contras, and he received regular detailed briefings on both. I have no doubt that he was told about the use of residuals for the Contras, and that he approved of it. Enthusiastically," end quote.
I mean, for me, that's some pretty damning evidence.
Yeah, and it's funny that they write it in their memoirs, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
The irony here is that the US pressuring other countries, like the US was basically during this time going around telling all the other countries not to sell arms to Iran, and this was during the Iran-Iraq war. And the fact that they were themselves selling them weapons underground is ironic, to say the least. Today, as in the year of our Lord 2020, June 6th, Saturday, where do you find Oliver North? Do you find him in a prison cell? Do you find him in Guantanamo Bay? No, absolutely not. You find him as the chair of the National NRA. I don't know what the NRA stands for, like the Rifle Association.
Guns, National Rifle Association.
Yeah, that's the one, the gun people. He's the chair of the gun people, the NRA, and he's a regular talking head on Fox News, both for gun rights as well as being the guy who warns everyone about the dangers of Iranian nuclear missiles from the guy who sold them the said missiles.
Oh, thank God for that,
Yeah, I mean, at least you could say he's speaking from experience.
I think pretty recently he had a spat with Wayne LaPierre of the NRA. And if you live in the States, you'll know who Wayne LaPierre is. He basically, whenever there's a incident of mass violence involving guns, shows up to be not guns, people. Like
guns don't kill people. People kill people with guns.
Right. But then I think perhaps Oliver North tried to institute a coup against Wayne LaPierre in the NRA or something like that. And I am so angry that this incident forced me to look at Wayne LaPierre and Oliver North and like take a side. But I'm not in the NRA, so I mean, I really don't care, aside from the political influence that that organization carries in this country.
It's like that The Onion headline, which is like heartbreaking. The worst person you know made a good point.
So how did this go over in Iran?
Oh, the guy who leaked the news to the Lebanese magazine that basically unveiled everything, Mehdi Hashemi, he was a senior official in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and he ended up being executed by Iran in 1987, officially due to unrelated reasons. They convicted him of like murder, corruption, treason, a bunch of crimes.
We're gonna frame you for murder.
Basically, yeah, and he ended up being executed. Well, he confesses, and I'm using the quotation marks here, he confesses and then he's executed.
Okay.
In the meantime, in America, literally not a single person, actually one person ended up going to jail for this, but I'm going to get back to that. Various people were convicted that were related to this, including Robert McFarland, the NSC advisor, Elliot Abrams, who was Robert McFarland's undersecretary, and we know him now as the guy who goes around trying to invade Venezuela. The Secretary of Defense at the time, Caspar Weinberger, they were all convicted of various crimes, along with a bunch of other people who I don't want to name, but various people were convicted. And all of them, to a dot, were pardoned by George H.W. Bush after he lost the 1992 election to Bill Clinton. So not having anything to, win, no elections to win.
Right, he's a lame duck president.
Yeah, so he just, basically pardoned all of them. As for Oliver North himself, his conviction was overturned due to a legal technicality. Basically, the defense claimed the conviction came from a testimony that violated North's Fifth Amendment rights. So the conviction was overturned.
I have a really hard time with this because I genuinely believe that everyone should be entitled to a fair trial and for their rights to be maintained, of course, but that's really annoying.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on the sense that I think everyone has a right to a fair trial and you have certain civil liberties that should not be violated, including the Fifth Amendment, which I think is like, a good legal idea. But it's one of those things where like everyone knows he did it. Like he even wrote in his memoirs that he did it. And he just gets away because of technicalities.
I feel like it's worth noting that in a way, just as Reagan's trickle-down economics does not work, trickle-down human rights does not work either, meaning that Oliver North was able to make a case that his rights had not been respected and have his conviction overturned. But if you are not Oliver North, if you are poor or you are Black or you have a disability or you're part of the queer community, those rights do not trickle down to you.
Yeah, those rights the wording may be the same on paper, but the application of those rights varies based on your income level, etc., like you said.
Right. So part of me thinks everyone is entitled to a fair trial, of course, and if these rights are not guaranteed to someone like Oliver North, then how would they be guaranteed to me or you? But then another part of me sees that in practice, that just doesn't seem to matter.
Yeah, that's the problem. I don't have an answer for this because, like, technically his defense were right, but it's not like he didn't do it, and it's not like he doesn't deserve some sort of punishment or consequences for his actions, because it was basically high treason.
Yeah, to draw a very loose parallel, when we are talking about O.J. Simpson, I think that he did it. However, the police bungled it up. The police were super racist. That was shown again and again and again. And the prosecution did not prove their case. I think that not guilty was the right verdict there, even though I think he committed that crime.
I agree.
Yeah, just my opinion on the most controversial case ever.
I do think that, like, broadly speaking, and I don't know if you want to do an episode on O.J. Simpson at some point, but I think broadly speaking, the burden of proof should always be on the prosecution. Always. And if the prosecution fucks up, it's on them. People with much less income than O.J. Simpson, who may not be able to afford the lawyers that O.J. Simpson was able to afford, would not have been able to point out the flaws in the prosecution and the racism endemic in the LA police department that OJ was able to do to get the not guilty verdict, even though I think he did it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting things about that case. Maybe we will do a full episode on it in the future. But it is an interesting study in how civil rights seem to work between different groups of people, different classes, different races, and how O.J. Simpson, being a very famous former pro football player, basically scrambled what the LAPD thought about Black men.
I do think we should make an episode of that. I really want to do that because I think there's a lot to be said about law and how laws are not just unequal written, but can be so poorly, disproportionately applied.
I'm kind of curious, Amr, going back to Ronald Reagan and Iran-Contra. If George H.W. Bush was Reagan's vice president, how is it really possible that following all of this, he was elected as the next president?
I'm glad you asked that because, by the way, as a tangent, I do want to say that H.W. Bush is the single person in the United States who claims that he doesn't know where he was when JFK was assassinated, even though his itinerary shows he was at Dallas at the time. So make of that what you will.
That's so weird.
Literally, I'm just saying. I'm not proposing anything. I'm just saying that this was we know. You know, he says he doesn't know where he was. He was in Dallas, but he said he doesn't know what he was doing at the time. But in this scandal, HW claims that he was out of the loop and he had no idea what was going on and no one told him anything, even though in his memoirs and his diary at the time, he stated that he was one of the few people who knew the full extent of the program, i.e. the entire selling weapons to Iran, taking money, giving money to Contras.
Why? Why do these people keep diaries and write about their crimes in them? One of the main reasons, actually, that we know David Ben-Gurion was a genocidal maniac is because he kept a diary and he also wrote letters to his son about expelling the Palestinians. Dear diary, today I did a war crime. Why would you write that down? If you are going to do some war crimes, 1, buy an industrial shredder, 2, do not write it in your diary.
Have you watched the TV show The Wire?
No.
It's a really good TV show. There's one scene that I want to, I don't know if any of our listeners watch The Wire. I do recommend it. It's one of my favorite shows of all time. But there's one scene where, all the, gang bosses are, at a sort of meeting between the bosses. And one of the side characters is on the side sitting there writing minutes for this meeting. And the boss, at the end of the meeting, stands up, walks to this guy and sees him writing. And he's like, what are you writing? And he's like, I'm your secretary. I have to write minutes for this meeting. And he's like, you're writing minutes for a criminal fucking conspiracy?
But it happens, apparently.
I can imagine HW being like, Dear Diary, today we armed some death squads. Also, I think this girl in my office likes me.
Yeah, but that's what they did. That's how we know so much about the Nakba in Palestine is because the soon-to-be Israeli soldiers who did it wrote it down.
And it's the same, you see it across, crimes. You see so many, memoirs of, Wehrmacht and SS troops and so on. British Imperial soldiers in India or whatever. And it's just so lackadaisical. It's like, yeah, we did these crimes today. Also, the tea here is good. The weather is nice. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, it perhaps speaks to the fact that in many of these cases, the perpetrators do not feel that what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Hannah Arendt. I think there's a lot of criticism, very valid towards her, especially the fact that she was dating Heidegger. But that aside, I do think there is something to be said about the banality of evil, how banal a lot of people who are otherwise evil are.
Right, and just totally apathetic to what they're doing.
Yeah, just basically paper pushers who are doing the most psychotic things but are so apathetic. For them, it's as simple as putting a stamp on an envelope and mailing it.
Right, or shoving over an old man on the sidewalk.
Yeah, and then walking.
Kneeling on someone until they suffocate.
Yeah. A while ago, I said that no one went to jail because of Iran-Contra, and technically I'm wrong. Exactly one individual ended up going to jail because of Iran-Contra, and his name is Bill Breeden. Bill Breeden was a former minister, as in a church minister, from Odon, Indiana, And he ended up stealing a street sign after the street was named John Poindexter Street in protest for the name. He was planning to hold the sign for a $30 million ransom, which was the amount that was given to the Contras as per the reports at the time.
Okay, I see the symbolism of that, but they could just make a new sign.
I mean, yeah, I assume it was more like a symbolic protest than actually hoping to get $30 million.
Right, of course.
But funnily enough, they did arrest and imprison him for, theft, which led Howard Zinn, the American historian, to remark that it made him, quote, the only person to be imprisoned as a result of the Iran-Contra scandal, end quote.
Poor Bill.
Yeah. Respect to Bill, though. Respect to a true guy, a true man.
Yeah.
So there's one last thing I want to mention in this story that I left for last because it's unproven and much less substantiated than everything else here. Everything else we mentioned here has been proven over and over again, from declassified documents to reports to people actually admitting in court. This was not proven. It's all alleged, even though there is evidence, it's not substantiated. So Gary Webb of the San Jose Mercury News alleged and claimed in the 1990s that the CIA helped the Contras smuggle cocaine into the US via Air America, which was an airline owned by the CIA. And the CIA were also middlemen in which they would buy Contra cocaine, giving them money for their cocaine, and then sell the cocaine to various drug gangs in inner cities in the United States, and thus flooding urban areas with crack cocaine, disproportionately affecting Black working class areas. And the profits of that enterprise ended up going back to the Contras to arm themselves. The US Senate at the time formed a commission to investigate these claims, chaired by Senator John Kerry, and they found no evidence of these claims. Now, is it true? Is it not? I don't know. It's ironic that this was happening during Reagan's war on drugs, where hundreds of thousands of people were sent to jail on punitive sentences for minor possession charges. But personally, in theory, I could see it happening, so I don't want to dismiss it out of hand. But it does seem convoluted way of funding the Contras. They could just do what they did, which was sell arms, give the money to Contras. They had no reason to buy the cocaine.
Yeah. Also, if we want to talk about addiction and biopolitics, things like cocaine, which are very physically addicting, can ravage a community, and it really doesn't need help from the government. By simply not caring, the government will abet the negative spread of that substance, or disease for that matter.
Yeah, I'm sure the government looked the other way because the populations that were being affected were not in their interest to rehabilitate. Yeah. So I'm like, in terms of carelessness, yeah, but I don't think the CIA was going around handing bags of cocaine to people. I could be wrong. I wouldn't be surprised if I was wrong on that end.
Right. I just think it's worth noting that the actions that the United States government did take here, and local governments, to criminalize people with addictions, to mandate very high sentences for drug crimes that weren't otherwise hurting anyone else, it didn't help those communities, it hurt those communities. And that is a huge, huge crime in and of itself, even without a conspiracy.
Oh, absolutely. People should have been going to jail, people in the government, for their complete carelessness and their punitive measures. It's the same with the AIDS crisis, to be honest with you. The Reagan administration's response to the AIDS crisis was criminal, even if it was just criminal through just lack of care.
Right. And there are also conspiracy theories that the United States government manufactured the HIV virus in a lab and deliberately spread it to vulnerable Black and brown and queer communities. And again, I think we should just note the Reagan administration's reaction to this, and the reaction of the drug companies and the people in power generally, was horrific enough.
Yeah, some things don't need to be conspiracies of the highest order to be criminal. The reaction enough was criminal.
Right.
There's a lot of things and a lot of implications, I think, arise from this entire scandal, even just the proven part. One of the things I do want to mention is how I personally believe the US political system is very broken, insofar as living in Canada, the way Canada works is you elect members of parliament to a federal parliament, And those members, you elect them, and they're part of various parties. And the party with the majority in parliament then becomes the executive branch by selecting from its members. Usually the party leader becomes prime minister, and then he selects cabinet members who are also MPs. The separation of branches in the US, the sort of, presidency on the one hand and the Congress on the other, I think this entire scandal shows this untenable conflict where it's like, who controls foreign policy? What is foreign policy? If Congress is giving you the money to enact foreign policy, are they responsible for the money or are you responsible for the policy? And where does the line stop,
Yeah, I feel like it's also relevant to our current political situation, talking about checks and balances, as law enforcement is terrorizing communities rather than making them safer. You presented this quote, I believe in a mini episode a few weeks ago, Amr. Who watches the Watchmen?
Oh yeah, I remember quoting that from the comic Watchmen, which is really good, by the way. It's also interesting you mention that because now you have people like Donald Trump saying that they're going to unleash the military on the protesters. And from a legal perspective, as commanders-in-chief, they kind of are technically legally allowed to do that. But then how can Congress check that power?
Right, or how can the military brass themselves perhaps check that power? Not that we should look to them for any sort of guidance, but...
Yeah. The other thing I want to look at is how Reagan committed high treason. And as you mentioned when you asked earlier, did he suffer any consequences? Was there any reaction to his basically high treason? And no, his polls dipped for a while and they recovered fairly quickly. They just bounced right back. And now he's one of the most popular presidents in US history. Certainly one of the most favorable in terms of, if you ask the average American. Democrats, at the time, the Democrats were the majority in the House, and Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, basically completely botched the response to the scandal, as Democrats basically are genetically predisposed to botch things. And it kind of brings to me this sort of question. I think we've discussed this in private before, Erin, about politics and how politics work from a pragmatic sense. Where if the roles were reversed and the right were given this opportunity to impeach a president of the opposing party, they would have taken it hook, line, and sinker, and they did with Bill Clinton over the most minor of things. But the Democrats were faced with this situation where the president basically committed high treason, and they had a majority in the House, and they did fuck all because they're Democrats.
I'm not sure what I think on this, to be honest.
Now, that's fair. I mean, to clarify, Tip O'Neill, even though he was critical of Reagan on domestic issues, he was completely hand in glove on foreign policy and was one of his supporters in terms of arming the Contras.
Well, there are plenty of issues where there's almost no distinction between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Israel's colonization of Palestine is one of those. Police brutality is another one. And the whole policing system in general, really. And then each of them in their own way also makes an effort to demonize the working class. The Democrats just put a smiley face on it.
Oh yeah, I agree. I completely agree.
I think the reason that conservatives adore Ronald Reagan, and the reason that they adore Trump for that matter, is not really that complicated. Like, both of these men appear to hate Black people and gay people, and in Trump's case, immigrants for sure. And hatred is a very good mobilizer, unfortunately.
I think it's just depressing that for a certain voting base, just the politics is of pure resentment, pure hatred and pure resentment. And any politician that speaks to that becomes wildly popular.
Yeah.
And I do want to add that the Contras who we spoke about, even though their name is like Contra-Revolution, which is counter-revolution, they were death squads. They were just more or less death squads. They killed and raped and murdered their way up and down Nicaragua, basically terrorizing villages with peasants and nuns and so on and so forth. And anytime the Sandinistas tried to engage them in any sort of military conflict, they would just run because they weren't exactly in it for the combat. They were in it for the sheer wanton brutality against people who couldn't fight back.
Ah, yes, you see, but they were anti-communist death squads, which is what we all know Jesus would have wanted.
Yeah, I'm sure Republican Jesus would have loved to see churches desecrated and nuns shot in the head because allegedly they were sympathetic to the Sandinistas. God bless Republican Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is an appalling thing. And I do think when we talk about people in the past, when we discuss history, you can't sanitize that sort of thing. Ronald Reagan's image has been so sanitized by his supporters.
Oh, yeah. And it's funny because Ronald Reagan once said in a speech, I recall, that the Contras were the moral equivalent of the founding fathers, which is technically true because the founding fathers were also horrible slaveholding, racists, rapists, sex pests. But
Mhm.
I'm sure the message he was trying to point was very different. And the fact that, he's being upheld, as, even among Democrats, you have people like Nancy Pelosi and these people coming out and saying, yeah, well, Trump was bad. We used to have a Republican Party under Reagan that was like politically opposing, but good at heart. And it's like, yeah, because everyone agreed that funding death squads was a good idea.
Well, you see it now with George W. Bush, too, which wasn't that long ago. Like, do we not remember the Iraq War and the lies that brought us into it? Do we not remember Hurricane Katrina and his response that led specifically to poor Black people being killed?
Yeah, it's just people's memories, especially like in terms of politics, are just so short. It's just horrifying to see.
Well, I think there is this quote, which is usually discussing psychology and interpersonal relationships, but it says, we don't remember much of what other people say. We remember how it made us feel. And I think, speaking from the position that I'm sitting in, like I wasn't an Iraqi child murdered by American soldiers. I wasn't a Black person in New Orleans whose house was lost to Katrina and then who was, shuffled around with no help from the government. So I didn't feel that pain the same way other people did. I can empathize with it, but I think it is this actually very simple thing where Ronald Reagan was a good speaker. He made people feel good, and that's what they remember.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I can see that. And I do think that, like, for some people, the Reaganite base or the Trump base, sometimes you'll see things like people will share videos of ICE detention centers or whatever, under the assumption that people would watch those videos and their feelings would change. And maybe like one or two would change. It's harsh, but important to realize that there's a significant base, a block, who will look at videos like the ICE detention centers or Reagan arming the Contras or whatever and say, good, we want more of that. For a certain voting base, like you said, conservatives adore him because he hates gay people. So like for them, his reaction to the AIDS crisis was, yes, we want that. We want that to happen.
Well, I think we are looking at the same images and feeling two different ways. Like I see those images and I feel disgusted and I empathize with the people in them. Whereas other people look at them and they feel powerful.
Yeah.
And that's extremely disturbing.
Yeah, it's so disturbing and so scary that those people are out there and their psychology is such as it is and they have political power. And I have no answer for how to deal with that.
I would say, especially as things are happening right now with the protests in support of Black Lives Matter and in remembrance of George Floyd, going back to what we were saying about keeping a diary, do not write down your crimes if you have committed any, but write down how you feel and go back to it. If you feel very angry right now, which you should, honestly, write it down. And later, when this happens again, remember that.
Yeah, I second that. I second that advice.
So, what can people do if they enjoy our podcast, Amr?
To find us, they can find us on Instagram at DasCriminalPod or on Twitter at the same tag, or on Patreon at just Das Criminal. This month, we will be releasing our mini episodes for free on all platforms and ask instead of donating to us on Patreon that you donate to a Black Lives Matters cause in your area.
We will make sure to put a link in the description to blacklivesmatter.card with 2 A's, CAARD.co, which is continuously updating places that need and are accepting donations. So instead of giving to our Patreon this month, if you like our mini episode that we're just going to put out there for free, show your support by supporting Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, so solidarity with all the protesters out there on the streets. Hope you all stay safe. Wishing you the very best and solidarity and strength. Until next time, everyone.
See you Wednesday.
Bye.